Good evening and welcome everyone to Radboud Reflect. My name is Christoph Lüthy. I'm Professor of Philosophy and Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology and Religious Studies at Radboud University, Nijmegen. I'll be your moderator tonight. We are really delighted to have Professor Michael Sandel in our midst this evening. Professor Sandel is Professor of Political Philosophy at Harvard University and is without doubt one of the most renowned, visible and influential political philosophers of our time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. You have written
It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. You've written numerous books on the most vexing moral and civic questions of our time. Your by now legendary course, Justice, has been viewed by tens of millions of people, and your books, for example, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, or Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, are international bestsellers. Our invitation to join us tonight, alas only virtually and not in person, has two reasons. The more immediate reason is, of course, your latest book, The Tyranny of Merit, which has recently come out in Dutch translation under the title De Tyrannie van Verdienste over de toekomst van de democratie. The more general reason is that we as Radboud University recognize ourselves in the series of standpoints that you've taken over the years and in ideals that you promote. We feel, as it were, a set of concerns that we as a teaching and research institution and you as an academic and public intellectual share. And this is why our Rector Magnificus, Professor Han van Krieken, is here to give you a special welcome. Please.
Welcome, dear Michael Sandel. I feel very fortunate to have you here for this discussion this evening. As Rector of Radboud University, it's a special feeling, since our university started 98 years ago as part of the Catholic emancipation movement. At that time, Catholics felt that through education, they could gain a place in the public life in the Netherlands, which was, until that time, not so much possible. Of course, nowadays, it's not the Catholics anymore that need further emancipation, at least not in the Netherlands, but other groups. And I'm proud that as Radboud University, we still attract a lot of students, first-generation students from our region, which includes a part of Germany. Students whose parents have not a college degree. And also personally, I feel very attached to that because my parents don't even have a high school diploma because they had to work when they were 14 and 15 to have an income for their families. I feel also lucky to be here because I came into the academic life through medical school, through a lottery, which was possible at that time. And my number was even so good that I could choose the university where I wanted to go, which was the local university, but actually the university that's the most Ivy League-like university we have in the Netherlands, namely Leiden. But I chose that university because I could stay home with my parents and keep my living because I had no idea what academic life as a student would be. So you can feel maybe that personally, but also as university rector, I'm very looking forward to an inspiring evening where you will discuss with our students, and some of our students and some of our teachers on the important topics of your book. So thank you for being here, and I hope you have a pleasant night as we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That means a lot.
Thank you so much, Rector van Krieken. Professor Sandel, you preferred to engage in discussion and debate rather than give a lecture. You will tonight meet the following people. Mathijs van de Sande, who is Assistant Professor of Political Philosophy here. Agnes Akkerman, who is a sociologist and full Professor of Industrial Relations. You will also be debating Cherelle de Leeuw, who is a master's student in political science, but also a city councillor of the Green Party. You will meet Marleen Huizingh, who is a lawyer and master's student in philosophy, also with a career in politics, and Florian van der Zee, a research master's student in political philosophy. The procedure tonight will be as follows. I will be allowed to start off the interview, and then we'll make the panel join you. And after that, at the end of tonight, there will be room for some questions from you, namely the audience. You can send in questions via, I think you've seen that on the screen right now, www.menti.com, and there is a code, and the code is 15227894. So either you see this on the screen, or you can find it on our website. Okay, maybe a good start, Professor Sandel, is for those of us in the audience who haven't read the book yet, to ask a general question about the book, namely the Tyranny of Merit. So those who've already read the book have noticed the urgency that is behind your book. So the question with which I would like to start is saying, whence this urgency? Why did it have to be written now? And what do you hope to change in the reader who reads this book?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Christoph. And I want to thank the rector for those warm and I find inspiring remarks about the university and also about the rector's own path. I find that very inspiring and very much in line with the ideals that inspired the book. Now, Christoph, you ask, well, what's the source of the urgency? I've been thinking about meritocracy in connection with debates about justice for a long time, but I began thinking about this book, trying to make sense of the events of 2016, the vote for Brexit in the UK, the election of Donald Trump in the United States. It was clear that animating these events and the similar rise of authoritarian populist movements in countries around the world, that something was happening. And how to make sense of it, that was the question that prompted me to write The Tyranny of Merit. And to speak of merit as a tyranny, I admit, is paradoxical because we ordinarily think of merit as a good thing, even as an ideal. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified surgeon to perform it. So merit as such is a good thing. And yet, meritocracy over the last 4 decades has turned toxic. And the book tries to explain why. And perhaps we can get into this as our conversation unfolds, Christoph.
Well, I think, thank you so much for your answer. We can start the discussion right away. I've been allowed to ask you one question, and here I go. You talked about 2016 and the populism that we connect with Donald Trump and Brexit. And of course, when you read your book, from our point of view, from our geographical point of view, much of it is recognizable. It's recognizable for 2 reasons. One is that we've all been watching, of course, this baffling 4-year period of Donald Trump, and we've all been following, of course, Brexit, and its equally long 4-year period that it took to come to an end, or to at least come to a resolution. And we also have our own populists here, and a similar kind of anti-meritocratic rhetoric. At the same time, however, there's also a sense, when one reads your book, there's also a sense that this is a particularly American story. Having lived in the United States myself for 7 years, I thought at the time that I lived there that maybe the greatest lie about the meritocratic promise from rags to riches was not so much college admission, but much more the kind of education you got at elementary school and high school. And I'm thinking now of a fact that if you're from a continental European country, you find completely unforgivable, namely that schools are being paid through property tax. So if you happen to be from a poor district, a kid per year might only get $5,000 worth of education. If you're from a particularly rich district, you might have as much as $40,000 invested in you per year. So the the playing field seems to be skewed from the very, very beginning. Now, when you speak about Trump and Brexit, one thinks, yes, the same thing is true for England. I mean, that is a particularly uneven educational system, although for different reasons. So if I can turn this into a question, the question would be, and that's a typical question from a kind of citizen of a social democratic welfare state of the type that you find in Scandinavia and in some parts of Western Europe, might it not be the case that the anger you describe at the educated elites is strongest in those countries where the school system is at its most skewed, and that you can avoid the takeover of these resentments by investing in good schools for everyone from the very beginning?
I'm certainly in favor of investing in good schools from the beginning, and you're certainly right, Christoph, that the system of school finance, primary and secondary school finance in the United States, is particularly backward and unprogressive because of the way in which poor schools are underfunded. So there is no question that this is a problem. It's a source of injustice, and it deepens inequality, and it makes social mobility more difficult. From all of these points of view, it's a bad system. Now, and I can see how it would seem especially shocking looking from a social democratic welfare state, which is more generous, more developed than that prevails in the United States. So I agree with the premise of your question. I'm not sure I would agree entirely to the suggestion, and perhaps you didn't intend this, Christoph, as a suggestion, that the social democratic welfare states of Europe are exempt from the tyranny of merit. Because I think one of the striking features, and there may be some specially acute American aspects of this problem, but what's striking, looking across democratic societies, including ones with strong social democratic welfare states, is how the mainstream political parties have lost a great deal of confidence and support among voters, and how the intellectual and ideological and political agenda and vision, especially of center-left parties, seems to have faltered, seems to have lost its capacity to inspire. And I think this is connected to the growing dependence of especially center-left political parties in Europe and in the US, in Britain, on these have become the parties of the professional classes, of the credentialed classes, of the well-educated, university-educated classes. And increasingly, these parties have alienated and lost the support of working people, and especially those without a university degree. And this, I think, connects the backlash against elites, the populist backlash that we see in political parties in France and in Germany. You know better than I do about the political scene in the Netherlands. Connects it to the sources of support that Trump was able to exploit, and that we see anti-immigrant and anti-European parties in Europe and in Britain exploit. And this, I think, has to do partly with dark things, xenophobia, strident nationalism, and in some cases, with Trump, for example, outright racism. But there's also another important aspect to the source of this backlash, populist backlash against elites. And this has to do with the sense among many people that elites, credentialed elites, look down on them, look down with disdain. In recent decades, Christoph, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening in all of our societies, poisoning our politics, pulling us apart. This has partly to do with widening inequalities, but it's not only that. It has also to do, it seems to me, with changing attitudes toward success that have come with it. Those who've landed on top during this age of globalization, of market-driven globalization. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that by implication, those who struggle, those left behind, must deserve their fate as well. And these attitudes towards success, I call it meritocratic hubris. The hubris among the winners, the sense of demoralization, even humiliation among those who lose out. This reflects a certain meritocratic ideal, the idea that if chances were equal, the winners would deserve their winnings. And I think this way of thinking about success has compounded the effect of the widening inequalities, not only in the US and Britain, but also, it seems to me, but you in this distinguished panel will tell me if I'm wrong, in many European democracies as well. We have created in recent decades societies of winners and losers, and this is at the heart of what I call, Christoph, the tyranny of merit.
Well, thank you so much for your eloquent reply. I would so much like to go through with my questions, but I'm not allowed to because I'm only the moderator. In fact, who will take over is Cherelle de Leeuw.
Yes, hi, thank you so much for being here and also for writing your book. I found it immensely thought-provoking, especially because it takes a notion that we take for granted and it turns it on its head, namely the fact that your talent or your education basically merits you a certain type of income. It's an issue that's taken for granted in political theory, but it's an issue that's also taken for granted in, well, real life, basically, and I found it really really inspiring to see you translate the one into the other, basically, into a discussion that I can also have with my mom, who doesn't have a college degree either. But when I was reading your book, you argue against using merit or education or basically any form of talent or luck as a moral basis for the redistribution of income and wealth. And I'm not going to say I was left a bit disappointed, but I was hungry for basically your answer to the question whether there is a moral basis for the allocation or the redistribution of goods or income. So I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yes, in fact, to clarify what could be a possible misunderstanding, for which I take full responsibility, if this is how you read it, Cherelle. The main thrust of my criticism of meritocracy is that it leads the winners to believe their success is their own doing. It cultivates the image that the successful are self-made and self-sufficient, and therefore that they owe little, if anything, to those who struggle, because those who struggle have no one to blame but themselves. And part of what makes this a kind of tyranny is that meritocracy is corrosive of the common good. It's corrosive of any sense of mutual responsibility for our fellow citizens. And that includes the responsibility of those who have flourished in the global economy to share their wealth and good fortune with those who have struggled in large part because of the configuration of the economy. And so the redistribution of the winnings, or rather the sharing of the winnings with everyone, with the entire society, is precisely a part of the politics of the common good that I am arguing for. And I think the only way we can begin to argue it for this more generous conception of the common good and the responsibility of the winners to share their winnings with those who haven't flourished in the new economy. The only way to make the case for that kind of redistribution is to build up resources of solidarity and of shared citizenship and of mutual responsibility that are obstructed insofar as we are in the grip of the self-image that it's all our own doing. So it is precisely, and here's where I want to clear up any possible misunderstanding, it's precisely to open us to this sense of shared responsibility that I argue against the idea that success is the doing of the successful, and that they therefore deserve the material rewards that flow their way in a market economy. So this is providing the moral basis for a greater sense of solidarity, and which I think we need if we're to begin to rebuild the social bonds that have come unraveled during the last 4 decades. Cherelle, does that address the worry that you had?
Kind of. No, it does. And I think that like arguing for the common good and solidarity, that's very important. In your book, you address basically tax and income disparities and stuff like that.
Right.
But your problem analysis focuses much more on rhetoric, on the use of language, and how are we going to, like fixing numbers or redistributional issues. That's, well, not easy either, politically at least, but it's something that can easily be fixed, I think. But like changing the language we use, the way we talk about people with lower income who are down on their luck, basically, is there, how are we going to change that? Because it's very easy to say, well, let's be more, let's focus more on the common good, but then how are we going to do that if the people that merit from this system don't have any real incentive to do so?
Well, I do think there is a connection, and you may disagree with this, but it seems to me there's a necessary connection in politics between political discourse, political argument, the moral foundations reflected in the terms of public discourse on the one hand, and the actual policies that are feasible that can on the other. Because we need a certain way of conceiving our common life and our shared citizenship if we're even to begin to reconfigure the economy in a way that honors our commonality. Now, one of the concrete ways I think we need to shift our public discourse to point to actual changes in policy and in the design of the economy is to focus less on what I call the rhetoric of rising. During the last 3-4 decades, mainstream politicians across the political spectrum, center right and center left alike, have addressed the widening inequality of globalization, not by dealing with it directly, by reconfiguring the economy, but instead by making an offer to those who suffered from the inequality, who suffered from wage stagnation and job loss, by offering them the following. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to university, get a degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. All of the emphasis was in dealing with inequality and wage stagnation by telling workers, go better yourself, get a degree. Now, I'm all in favor of expanding access to higher education. That's a good thing for its own sake. But it's a mistake to assume or to frame a whole political project around the idea that the way to respond to inequality and wage stagnation is to tell workers they're not well educated enough and they, as individuals, should try to better themselves. So the shift I argue for in the book is from arming people for meritocratic competition toward focusing more on the dignity of work, on renewing the dignity of work, on making life better for everyone, regardless of how well credentialed they are. And I discuss a range of policies that could do this, including greater investment in those forms of learning that most people depend on to prepare themselves for the world of work, including vocational and technical training. That's just one example. But the broader theme is to recognize that work is not only a way of making a living, not only a way of gaining access to purchasing power, it's also a way of contributing to the common good and winning recognition for having done so. Part of what I think is so deeply frustrating to many working people, that's galling even to many working people, is the sense of being looked down on, the sense that the work they do is not honored or recognized or esteemed by the wider society. That should be our political project. And by our political project, I mean of those parties who would offer a way of speaking to the sense of grievance, to the legitimate sense of grievance by working people, that a society of winners and losers, where the winners are defined largely by their credentials, have left them, a great many people, behind. So it's a matter of philosophical framing, it's a matter of political rhetoric, but it's also a matter of shifting the focus of the response by politics, by the political system, by the national community to the condition of inequality, the society of winners and losers, the loss of social esteem by a great many workers that have fueled, understandably, the discontent that we see in democratic societies everywhere. Cherelle, I hope that addresses the kind of question you had in mind.
Well, it better had, because Cherelle is out of words, and I give the word to Marleen Huizingh.
Yes, well, thank you. The last words you spoke about democracies, that is actually what I found in the book the most interesting connection that you make. You know, all the flaws of meritocracy and their consequences on democracy. And I found that, well, actually very, very interesting, but also a bit alarming, and giving me a sense of, well, the urgency that Christoph talked about in the beginning, our urgency towards the future of our democracies. And I have a question that actually came from me reading your acknowledgements in the back of your book, after reading the book, where you tell us that you have discussed your book or themes in your book with many people, being colleague, Ivy League professors, your Harvard students, some renowned academic institutes worldwide. And I was, after reading that, to be honest, I felt a bit uneasy, especially just, you know, reading your book and the theme where you talk about the winners and the losers. And it seemed that in consulting people when you wrote the book, you kind of were in the group of the winners, and I was kind of thinking, well, did you talk or consult also the losers? This is not my term, of course, but so.
Nor mine, I should say.
No, of course, I understand. It's the way, well, maybe society perceives or people perceive themselves, I don't know, but let's stick to the terms. So I was wondering, first of all, did you talk to or consult in writing this book the losers? And maybe an even broader or more general thought, when we talk about the future of democracy, you yourself just talked about political parties, representation, but maybe even in political philosophy, like you yourself and all of us here, there is hardly any representation of, well, let's say again, the losers of society. And To me, that feels like a problem because, well, different standpoints are needed, I think. We see that in the philosophy of science also, to get a broader idea of the problem and also of the analysis and the solution. So I feel we have a focus on standpoints of gender, of ethnic or racial backgrounds, of religion, but it seems that social class isn't something that we, I don't know, that we even consider to be an important standpoint in political philosophy. Right now we are, and we are thankful for it, but we are discussing with you, a Harvard professor, and we read and discuss all the theories of you and your colleagues. So what are your thoughts on that? Is there a blank spot in all of our worlds right now?
Well, I think the issue of representation, which you've identified, is of central importance to this challenge. And the first place we should look, and you said you found the analysis alarming, and it is alarming. First place we should look to understand what's the crisis democracy is facing in our societies is that institutions of representative government, as well as institutions of higher education, I discuss both in the book, as you know, and we've been more attentive, though perhaps still not attentive enough, to broadening access and representation to institutions of higher education and institutions of representative government along lines of race and gender and ethnicity. Then we have, with regard to class representation. And one of the most striking questions of representation, and I've been unaware of this until I was doing the research for the book, is if we look at the membership of parliaments, of legislatures in democracies around the world. During this period of 4 decades, roughly speaking, the age of merit and of market-driven globalization or neoliberal globalization, those without a college education have become virtually absent from parliaments and legislatures in our societies. Virtually absent. If you look at the representation of people without a university degree or from a working class background in parliaments and legislatures in the major Western democracies today, the percentages are tiny. So small is the percentage of those without a university degree in the parliaments of Western Europe and Britain and the United States that it is approaching the levels, or put it another way, so great is the dominance of those with a university degree in these places, in these parliaments, that it's approaching the degree of representation that existed back in the days of the late 19th century when there was a property qualification for voting.
Yeah.
And then when universal suffrage came in, there was a substantial increase in the 20th century in representation of working people and those without university credentials in parliaments. But by the 1990s and 2000s, it's in terms of representation, almost as if we're back in the days before universal suffrage. And we take this for granted. What's striking, what's alarming, to borrow your term, Marleen, is there's very little debate about this. This is especially striking if we recognize, which those of us who spend our time in the company of the credentialed can forget, Most people in our societies do not have a 4-year or a 3-year university degree. The majority do not. In the United States, nearly 2/3 do not have a 4-year university degree. And in most Western European countries, I don't know the exact, perhaps you will know, the exact figure in the Netherlands. The majority of people do not have a university degree. And yet, almost all representatives elected to parliaments do.
Right.
And this, I think, requires attention. This issue has not been at the forefront of the populist complaint against elites, but it's a symbol of how, despite our emphasis on broadening access and diversity with regard to race and gender and ethnicity, all of which are very important, we have not done the same for class or educational background. And so perhaps it's no surprise that the sense of disempowerment and alienation and exclusion has begun to run so deep that many working people resent mainstream parties dominated by credentialed elites and are letting it be known, often in dangerous ways, fueling undesirable, dangerous, alarming right-wing populist political parties and movements. So I think any attempt to deal with the tyranny of merit has to be more alive than we have been to the educational and class background of representative institutions, not only in government, but also, and perhaps we'll come to this, in higher education.
Right, because, well, I think we recognize your plea very much so. Right now in Holland there are elections, and I wrote an article that I think less than 1% of the people that are probably being elected do not have higher degrees. So, I mean, this is a very true point also in our society. But I was kind of trying to look at ourselves, like the political philosophers or political philosophy in general. If we look at the French philosopher Pierre Rosanvallon, he states that democracy consists of institutions, administration, contra-democracy, but also he feels a very important part is the thinking part of democracy. And the thinking part of democracy is mainly what we are doing right now and what is your profession also. And I was also wondering, of course, we should do something about representation in parliament and political parties, institutions and so on. But how do you see we can, well, say, open up our own world, our own political philosophers' world to an extent where we also incorporate the thinking power of people without an education. Yeah. Do you see how we can do that?
Professor Sandel, can you keep the answer short? Because we have a whole queue here of other questions. Thank you.
Okay. Well, this is a very important question. I'll try to address it briefly. I very much agree that the thinking part of democracy, and I don't know if you were quoting Pierre Rosanvallon on that, but I love that phrase, is an important part of creating a democratic culture. In the book, I address this directly by suggesting that we've made a mistake, especially thinking about the teaching of moral and political philosophy and civic education. We've made a mistake to concentrate this activity in the citadel of higher education and then conduct a meritocratic tournament to see who will gain access to it. And as you remember from the end of the book, what I argue for is going beyond even a fair equality of opportunity toward what I call a broad democratic equality of condition. And one of the central aspects of that project is a broad diffusion of learning and of education, including of moral and political philosophy and civic education, beyond the walls or the gates of academia, where we would have access to teaching and learning and discussion, especially about civic questions, within civil society, in unions, in the workplace, in community colleges, in vocational and technical training centers. This broad diffusion of democratic learning, I think, is essential to creating a culture and a diffusion, a democratic equality of condition. And in terms of experiments that I've done, and there are only experiments in this direction, they include using technology to open access to my Harvard classroom to create free public access online to my entire justice course for whomever wants to watch it, engage with it anywhere in the world, and also to go further and try to create global platforms for public discussion, whether using the internet or using radio and television, traditional media, to bring the kinds of debates that political philosophers deal with into contact with the world and citizens who care about these questions, whether they be credentialed or not. And a large part of my activity has been in developing, especially using technology platforms, to do experiments to see how we might make this possible. So it's a subject, it's a project that I care deeply about.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's find out whether the question by Professor Agnes Akkerman goes in the same direction. And I would like to ask everyone involved in Harvard and in Nijmegen to keep questions and answers short, because otherwise we run out of time.
Okay, thank you, I'll try. First of all, it's a great pleasure for me to engage in a conversation with you on your book and most importantly on its message. As a sociologist, I am inspired and interested most of all on the divide between those with a college degree and those without a college degree. And although your analysis is predominantly a normative analysis, I would like to focus on the empirical analysis of it. So the empirical message, claim you make, I would summarize as follows. The overappreciation of merit in terms of education or effort leads to feelings of superiority in those who were able to obtain a degree in higher education, giving the ones who did not the idea that they are looked down on, leading to resentment, eventually leading to a preferences for what we would call populist parties. And I would like to shine some light, some empirical light, on two elements of this hypothesis. The first one, people without a college degree feel humiliated and looked down on. Second, this leads them to turn to populist political parties. My research team and I collected data on exactly those sentiments you describe in your book. We asked them whether they felt detached from society or excluded, whether they had the feeling that others didn't appreciate the value of what they did, whether they felt looked down on, and whether they felt invisible in society. We related these feelings to their educational attainment and their political preferences. We do find support for your empirical claim. Yes, those not having a college degree or a degree in higher education feel looked down on. And yes, these feelings correlate with a higher preference for populist political parties, also in the Netherlands. However, we also found another important factor, and that is people's employment contract, which also correlates with these sentiments, these feelings of feeling humiliated. This means two things. First, And it does relate regardless their educational attainment. So this means two things. First of all, of the people without a college degree, in particular those in unsecure labor, suffer these feelings of being looked down upon or feeling left out and detached from society. Second, also people with a degree in higher education feel humiliated and looked down upon if they work in unsecure labor, employment. These findings raise two questions in me. First, can your analysis help to interpret or explain this finding? Is this just another consequence or feature of meritocracy or something else? And second, a more practical question, would reorganizing the labor market institutions, such as employment protection legislation, not be an easier or even maybe a sufficient solution to the problem than changing the perceived relation between the elite and the working class, which cannot be enforced and would take at least one generation, if not more?
Well, it's fascinating, the studies that you've done, and I would like to read them. I'd be fascinated to read them, and perhaps afterwards you could share with me some of the references, or I will look them up. This is fascinating to me, including the last part you mentioned about insecure labor, which is going to matter more and more in the gig economy, where more and more workers are working at jobs that are not under a regular employment contract. As to your question about how I would interpret this and whether it's in line with my general account, I think it is through the notion of the dignity of work, which I argue has been eroded, and that the erosion of the dignity of work, I think, has been a big part of the grievances and sense of disempowerment. And it's easy to see the connection between insecure labor contracts and people feeling that their work is not dignified or appreciated or honored or respected. So developing the normative framework of the dignity of work, I think, would be very much consistent with your findings about insecure labor being an independent factor in explaining people's sense of social exclusion. Whether fixing that through regulation of the employment contracts would be a sufficient response to the sense among many working people or non-college educated workers, their sense of exclusion and disempowerment. I think it would be an important step, but I don't think it would be sufficient. A very important step and very worthwhile, but I would not see it as a separate measure from calling into question the relation between well-credentialed elites and the working class. The reason is, first, even to get those regulatory reforms of the labor contract, I think we have to call into question the sharp divide between credentialed elites who feel entitled and who look down upon working people without a university degree, because it's going to be difficult to build this political support even to establish regulatory response to insecure labor without making people aware of that divide and the importance of overcoming it. Then the reason I think it's an important step but not a sufficient step is that we have to reward work properly, both in financial terms, but also, I think, in terms of honor and esteem and dignity. And this requires changing regulations, but also changing attitudes. And I agree with you that changing attitudes is a longer-term project and a more difficult one. So I would say, let's go for both. Let's institute such regulatory reforms of the labor that we can, and I would say also strengthen unions to give workers voice, which is also an important part of dignity. But in the course of doing that, we need to rethink the attitudes, and we need to try to repair the gulf of esteem between the credentialed elites and large numbers of working class men and women.
I must, alas, assume that you're entirely swayed by the answer.
This is a perfect answer, thank you.
But the good thing is that you'll be in contact afterwards. I give the floor to Florian van der Zee.
Yes, thank you so much for your interesting book and this opportunity to ask you some questions that occurred to me when reading it, that stayed with me. And there were two, most of all. And the first one has to do with the topic that we just talked about. So basically the ideal of meritocracy can be summarized with the statement that you get what you deserve. And you point out that there are two sides to this belief or this ideal. First, there is the exaltation of human agency. It is your effort that determines where you end up. And second, there is the moral dimension, that the rewards bestowed upon you as a function of where you've ended up are in agreement with what you morally deserve. And you address both of these problems both in the form of critique, and you attempt to find ways of countering them practically. So in the second to last chapter of your book, you addressed most of all the exaltation of human agency. When you introduce, or when you say that against this idea, we should introduce chance or fortune. For example, you say we could introduce a lottery of the qualified into the college admissions process of the most selective colleges. And in the last chapter of the book, you talk about the erosion of the dignity of work and about the need for contributive justice, for the redistribution of both recognition of the moral contribution of certain types of work, and as a means of accomplishing that, the redistribution of wealth. And I was wondering, I had the feeling that when you take the last project of contributive justice very seriously, the two aims might clash, that this last project might reintroduce the notion of getting what you deserve. And I was wondering whether you agreed and how you think about this.
Great, it's a brilliant question and beautifully put. Thank you for that. It's really terrific and subtle. You're right, there is both a criticism of, well, the allure of meritocracy is that we can make it if we try. We are self-made and self-sufficient, this idea of human agency that you mentioned, Florian. And but then contributive justice, which addresses this question of the dignity of work, seems to reinstate a kind of alignment between the contributions we make and the honor we receive. And isn't that reintroducing a kind of appreciation of merit or contribution? It's really, really an astute and subtle question. Let me see if I can respond to it. I would respond to it by focusing on how you characterized the ideal of human agency that underlies the kind of heady, appealing, inspiring promise that I can live in a world, we can live in a world where the winners deserve their winnings because they've done it themselves. It's our doing. What I'm challenging in challenging this idea is not the promise of human agency as such. But I'm challenging construing human agency or human freedom in individualistic terms. It's an individualistic, an overly individualistic idea of agency that I'm challenging. You can make it if you try. That's an individualistic promise. I am self-made and self-sufficient. My success is my own doing. The way I want to lean against this is not to extinguish agency, not to say we are just drifting and that all of life and all of our fate exceeds human control. What I want to say is we exercise freedom not only as self-making individuals, but as members of a political community engaged in a project. And that project involves contributing and answering the needs of others and receiving recognition. This is the second point about dignity of work, and receiving recognition for the contributions we make. Our contributions are reflected back to us. And this is a source of integrating me with the community as a whole. And when a scheme of contributive justice is intact, we have a society of mutual recognition and mutual dependence. So the idea that we are mutually dependent is at odds with the first idea of individual agency. My success is my own doing. And so on reflection, what that image of self-making misses is not only the role of luck in life, but also the sense in which I am indebted for my success. We are indebted for our success. And to begin to reflect on the sources of our debt, as well as the sources of our luck and good fortune, our attention is redirected toward the economy and the society as a scheme of mutual contribution and recognition. And it's this, ultimately, that tempers or constrains, Florian, this individualistic notion of agency that is embodied in the meritocratic ideal and in the winners and losers and in the forgetting of luck and indebtedness. So I would not extinguish agency. I would have us reconstruct it as a kind of collective understanding of agency. We can be participants in shaping our fate, provided we do it together in community with fellow citizens whom we understand as equals and whom we recognize through a scheme of mutual recognition. That's how I would address the tension that you very astutely identified. It's an individualistic notion of agency that I think is the heart of the problem. And that's why the scheme of contribution and recognition addresses it rather than undermines it. Do you see what I'm proposing, Florian?
Yes, I do.
Yes, and for fear that he will ask another astute question, I'm swinging quickly to my subtle colleague from the philosophy department, Mathijs van der Sande.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Sandel. I would like to get back to some of the issues that were already raised by Cherelle in the beginning of this conversation, namely about the difference between, say, discursive change in public discourse on the one hand, and institutional change on the other. And I think that's particularly important because, as you've already stressed a couple of times, this tyranny of meritocracy, of course, affects the legitimacy of our democratic institutions and procedures as well. So it has very strong democratic implications. And it struck me, as some others have also already suggested, that most of the proposals that you develop in your book seem to be intended to affect the public discourse. But if we really want to change something about the legitimacy of our democratic institutions and how it is perceived, then arguably we may also need to do something about the structural form of these institutions and procedures. Now, what struck me also when I read your book is that you make a case for lottery specifically in the context of education. But how I read it, perhaps I misread it, how I read it, your book, is that the educational system and the high rate of competition there is, at least in part, a symptom or a symbol for a much more widespread meritocratic discourse. So only one aspect of what we may call meritocracy. Yet when you talk about solutions, you only apply the solution of the lottery to the educational system. And that struck me because there is also a contemporary philosophical debate on sortition. So the use of lottery in our democratic institutions as well. Some philosophers argue now, and it's quite a popular debate at the moment, argue that we should replace at least some of our representative institutions and assemble them on the basis not of elections, but on the basis of sortition, of lottery, and basically let a random selection of citizens, we can involve a number of criteria, of course, gender, etc., but let a random selection of citizens make major decisions in legislative or policy debates. So my question to you would be, couldn't we, if we agree with your analysis, if we share your analysis on the damage that this meritocracy does to our democratic institutions and its legitimacy, couldn't we propose to expand this idea of lottery to our democratic institutions as a whole, and not only articulate an alternative political or public discourse, but also more radically change the way our democratic institutions are set up?
Yes, yeah. It's a great question, and the short answer is, I think it's worth exploring. And I think that some versions of sortition could be compatible with and a possible response to the tyranny of merit, with the following qualification. It's important not to see a lottery system or a system of sortition for government as an alternative to the current system understood as a system where we have the best people who are elected and therefore govern. Because a big part of the problem currently with representative government is that the people who are governing are not the most meritorious, even though they may be the most credentialed. I would distinguish between the two. I think one of the main defects in the system of representative government that we have now is, first, it's highly unrepresentative in ways we discussed earlier, especially with regard to class and educational background. But also that, at least in my country, it's dominated by money. There's a kind of oligarchic capture of democratic and representative institutions. So I would ideally like to radically reduce the role and influence of money in the election of representatives. And part of the appeal of sortition is it would be a way of overcoming and really leaping beyond a system where money matters more than it should, and also where credentials, especially technocratic credentials, matter more than they should. So for those reasons, it might be, I would be open to exploring various ways of bringing sortition to bear, at least in some elements of representative government, but I don't want to give up entirely on representation in democracy. I would rather criticize the role of money and oligarchic capture and try to remove those corrupting influences. And I would rather draw attention to the credentialist prejudice, and also I would say the technocratic civic formation of those who dominate representative institutions. I would rather put it another way. I would rather give working people a greater voice in democracy, if we could do that effectively, than give up on representative democracy. But if we can't, or as a way of breaking through the combined credentialist, technocratic, oligarchic tendencies of representative democracy, as a way of breaking through those obstructions, I think it might be worth considering at least elements of sortition, of lottery. I would add one more thing. It need not only be with regard to representative institutions or parliaments or legislatures. Various forms of national public service could also be a way of creating more class mixing than we currently have in civic life. And this too, I think, could begin to reverse the tendency of those who are well-credentialed and who are affluent to live separate lives and have separate interests and outlooks from those without such credentials.
Yes.
Yes, well, I mean, I mean, I agree, of course.
My idea was rather, unfortunately, this is...
Oh, I thought you were inviting me to. Okay,
no,
thank you.
No, the very sad thing is, if you had come to Nijmegen, as we very much hope you will very soon, you would have had dinner with us beforehand. We would now have 2,500 people in the city's concert hall. We would have passed around microphones. There would have been microphones and drink afterwards. So all of us could have asked more questions, and the audience would also have asked lots of questions. Now, since we are in the pandemic age, I got virtually hundreds and hundreds of messages here, and you will understand that the questions I'm going to ask from the audience are a perfect mixture of merit and chance. Some questions are understandable, so that's a merit. And others just happen to lie under my eye. So I will cluster some of them and ask them to you. One cluster of questions we got had to do with political systems. There was a question saying, isn't meritocracy just the basic way in which you run capitalist societies? And then someone else says, well, if that is so, what about China? Hasn't China become an even more contested rat race between people? Is that not even more meritocratic? And someone else says, what about Cuba? Would you prefer that? So these are the, let's say, three political questions about systems on which my eye happened to fall.
Well, let me try to address them collectively under the general heading of the relation between meritocracy and capitalism. It certainly seems to be the case that the tyranny of merit, as I call it, the growing divide between winners and losers, has come about during the same period of time, roughly the last 4 decades, and in tandem with the embrace by mainstream parties in Western democracies of a neoliberal version of capitalism. And it's come together with a kind of market faith, a faith that began in the Reagan-Thatcher era, but that continued when center-left parties succeeded Reagan and Thatcher. Bill Clinton in the US, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, who moderated but consolidated the meritocratic faith. Sorry, the market faith. First and foremost, the market faith, the idea that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good, but closely connected to the market faith was the meritocratic project. And the meritocratic project had the effect of reinforcing and entrenching, rather than challenging, the inequalities that resulted from the era of neoliberal globalization. Because it was the meritocratic project that said the winners deserve their winnings. And if you want to become a winner, get a university degree. It was the meritocratic project that addressed the deepening inequalities brought about by neoliberal globalization by saying, you can make it if you try. And that said, those who land on top deserve to be there because they've worked harder, they've acquired the credentials that the new economy, the global technological economy require. So I think there is a close connection between the version of capitalism that has played out in recent decades, the widening inequalities, and the meritocratic political project which has responded to those inequalities by, not by undoing them, but by offering a rationalization for them. Now, to be sure, it's a rationalization that presupposes that everyone has an equal start. And we know that the project of giving everyone an equal start is unrealized. But, so I think that meritocracy and capitalism are not the same, but in the past 4 decades, the version of capitalism that has predominated and the version of the meritocratic project that has defined our politics have gone together. And I think we need to question both. In my earlier book, I wrote about the moral limits of markets, and in the Tyranny of Merit, I tried to take on the attitudes towards success that in effect rationalized the inequalities that came about by the era, the age of market faith. That's how I see the connection between the two.
Thank you so much. I do hope that the people in the audience who ask these questions are satisfied. Unfortunately, you can't ask any follow-up questions like us here. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, Professor Sandel. One is from a theologian who said, well, how are you going to go about persuading people to live and work for the common good? He adds, or she adds, as a theologian, I know how to explain that, but how do we do that in a secular age?
One of the striking features of the meritocratic project, as I've called it, is that it adapts for a secular age an age-old theological question. And there are striking echoes between our secular version of meritocracy and the theological origins of the debate as it was about salvation. Is salvation something we earn by doing good works and by being faithful followers of God and God's commandments and the religious rites and increasing the glory of God? Is salvation something we earn, a matter of our merit? Or is salvation a gift of God's grace, an unearned gift? And this debate, going back at least to Augustine and Pelagius, and then Martin Luther, who was reasserting the Augustinian picture of salvation being entirely an unearned gift of grace. Luther in the Protestant Reformation in many ways was mounting a powerful critique of, as he saw it, of meritocracy. The idea that salvation was a matter of merit, something we could earn. He was arguing for grace. Well, when the Puritans came to America, the Puritans came to America and developed the Protestant work ethic, pretty soon work and earthly success became a sign of salvation, not yet a source. But in time, hard work and worldly success came to be seen as a source, not merely a sign of salvation, the shift from grace to merit. Now, in many ways, the dialectic of merit and grace in regard to salvation is played out today in a seemingly secular age with regard to worldly success and material rewards. To what extent are they a matter of luck and good fortune? To what extent are material rewards something we have earned and therefore deserve? So there is a striking echo in our debates in a seemingly secular age about earning and deserving, about gift and grace, that recapitulate the ancient theological debates. So what do we learn from that about how to persuade people in a secular age to reconsider the tyranny of merit? How do we redeploy notions of gift and grace, I suppose? That's the project. I think in a way we have to find a way. We talked earlier about luck, the role of luck in life. We talked earlier about indebtedness. This is a moral vocabulary that connects with, and I think we should connect, with the older notion of gift and grace and fortune in order to remind the successful that, to remind the successful not to inhale too deeply of their own success, not to forget the luck and good fortune and sense of indebtedness and gift that help us on our way. That's not a recipe for persuasion, perhaps, but it's a direction, and a direction that casts a look back to the theological origins of the debate that gave shape, surprisingly as it may seem, to the secular debates we have about who deserves what today.
Thank you. We have to finish, but I've been asked or encouraged to finish with a snappy question. And here is the snappy question which asks for a snappy answer. Suppose it was going to be President Sandel and not President Biden to take over. What would have been 3 of the measures taken in the first 100 days?
Well, for the first one, I would go for the relief package he just passed, $1.9 trillion, which finally provide real help from the community. It's a kind of redistribution, to go back to one of the very first questions this evening, for poor people and working class people who have suffered most during the pandemic. And so I think I would endorse that as a good start. And for my second 2 measures, well, here are 2. First, in order to demonstrate a renewed emphasis on the dignity of work and on contributive justice, I would tax earnings from labor. I would no longer tax earnings from labor at a higher rate than earnings from capital gains and dividends and interest. Not only because that would have the effect of redistributing income from the rich to the poor and those in the middle, but because it would be a way of signifying a renewed appreciation for the dignity of work. And then I think I would, I would add 2 other, if I can add 2 other. One would be
Add one. Because we have...
investments in vocational and technical training as a way of expressing support for those who don't get a university degree, but who make valuable contributions to the common good through the work they do. And finally, I would consider a program of universal national service to draw people out of their bubbles, their isolated, segregated modes of existing, so that young people at some point in their lives, whether or not they went to university, would encounter young people from all walks of life, from different ethnic and racial and cultural and also different class backgrounds in the course of contributing some meaningful service to the country.
We very much hope that your words have been heard also back home. Thank you so much indeed for spending this last hour and a half with us. This has been a great pleasure, and we do hope that we can soon welcome you here in our city. So the moment has come for me to thank everyone here present: Cherelle de Leeuw, Florian van der Zee, Marleen Huizingh. Here you are, Agnes Akkerman, Mathijs van der Sande, our rector magnificus, the great folks of Radboud Reflects, Chitty Temples, and of course, above all, you yourself, Professor Michael Sandel. We are very, very grateful that you've been with us. I hope...
Thank you for having me. Greatly enjoyed it, Christoph. Thank you.
Well, do come back, really, in person. Thank you so much. And now to the audience, I hope you've all enjoyed this evening with Radboud Reflects. If you thought that this was an interesting event and you haven't subscribed yet to the newsletter, please do so, or follow us on social media. And should you want to support us with more than just a thumbs up, which you can also do, we're always delighted to accept donations. So you have a button on your screen to do that. As you can imagine, with all the staff here present, Radboud Reflects is an organization that deserves sponsoring. We'll be back on Thursday with our next live stream at 12:30. We will discuss the results of the Dutch elections and the implications for the country, and who will do so. That will be sociologist Take Sipma, political scientist Andrei Zaslove, and historian Carla van Balen. Now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a good time. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Bye-bye.